geçeyim dedim. İstersen. Sağıma da gelebilirsin. Sağıma da istersen daha iyi. Yes. Kafaya verelim, otur. Ups.
She lost the...
Sağ ol. Evet.
Kısa kısa mı konuşacağız? Nasıl istiyorsun abi sen? Söyle.
10'ar dakika falan. Bir saatimiz var.
Ha 10'ar dakika.
Evet.
Güzel.
Okey, ben geçeyim.
I was coming from Utah, so a little longer, 5 hours longer than coming from New York. So longer.
Duyuluyor mu acaba? Duyuluyor, tamam. Esteemed colleagues, thanks for honoring this panel. Today and tomorrow we have a very distinguished set of panelists. When I invited them, I told them that this was going to be a liberal exchange of ideas, a meeting of minds. The main idea, of course, is we diplomats tend to be too much theoretical at times, but what we talk about is happening somewhere. So, during the last 2 days, there is this very strong consensus of opinion that there is nothing much to be letting us to be optimistic. So we should be really try to be a real politician. And in order to be that, we have to know what's going on in the ground. So that was the main idea. On over 2 days, we will discuss what is happening and why it's happening. And then where are we? How did we arrive here? Different world-famous academicians will approach these, in fact, two very basic questions through their disciplines and their own experience. Let me first introduce today's panelists. We will have to land, it's not going to be, you were a very real politician on that. It will be about 10 minutes or so, your interventions, because the Kenyan foreign minister would have to leave before envisaged. But there is no protocol here. Let me start with Professor Malik Mufti. He is, in fact, I would say one of us, because he's a graduate of Tarsus American College. His family produced 3 different, of course, Jordanian ambassadors to Ankara. His father is Tunisian and his mother is Turkish. So he's a graduate of Harvard University, and he has a Master of Arts from Yale, then PhD from Harvard on Middle Eastern Studies and Political Science. He is right now at Dean of Harvard, there is another Dean of Harvard, of course, but Malik Mufti is the Dean of Tufts Political Science. He has some very well acclaimed books. One is Daring and Caution in Turkish Strategic Culture, Republic at Sea. That was published in 2009. Before, there was the much acclaimed Sovereign Creations, Pan-Arabism and Political Order in Syria and Iraq. Somehow, Mr. Mufti is being vindicated today, I guess, but we'll hear from him. Then we have our very own Mustafa Aydın, rector of Kadir Has University. He has been a friend of almost all of us. He knows quite a lot about that. When I said I mixed him up, I didn't salute him in the corridor, and he said, "Why are not you saluting me? You invited me here." I said, I thought you were, whom did I say? Kerem Kıratlı, you were looking at Kerem, and I will tell Kerem Kıratlı that you didn't want to speak to him, which is, of course, a gross exaggeration of what I tried to say. He has published many important articles and books, some of which the Turkish foreign policy framework and analysis, but he is right now rector of Kadir Has University. Rafael Flor, he is also one of us by virtue of being married to a Turkish lady. You could have applied for Turkish nationality within the first month, but I think that has passed now. But you can still, you know so many diplomats here, will help you to do that. He is from Ecuador, that's why I'm telling this. He is a graduate of Berkeley and Tufts, and he is the CEO of Earth Institute at Columbia University. That is the main observant of what's happening on climate change, demographic change, and all that. So we do need to go to the nitty-gritty. And last but not least, of course, we have Mr. Professor Len Pritchett of Kennedy School of Government. You have all heard about those very complicated World Bank reports. He writes them. He wrote at least 4 of them, including infrastructure for development, making services work for the poor, better health systems for India's poor, findings, analysis, and options. And of course, he is also the author of The Rebirth of Education and Let Their People Come, breaking the gridlock on global labor mobility. This is really very important because it is because of those developments in those spheres that we confront today's problems. One day, an American went to a Frenchman with a perfectly feasible investment idea. The Frenchman taught on this, and he reported back, I'm sure it will work perfectly well, but I am not sure it will work theoretically. So this is also our dilemma. I hope that we have also organized through Bilkent University some programs. Tomorrow we will hear Stephen O'Brien, UN Deputy Secretary General, Jeffrey Sachs, who is a very famous indeed professor on all of these matters, and Mrs. Margaret Macmillan, a very top-ranking historian, writer of Versailles 1919 and all that. So without further ado, you are not here to listen to me. You have been listening, some of you, during the last 35 years. In case of Reha, it goes back, and Hayret, 45 maybe years. So I will let the floor, and I will... Malik, why don't you... I think you should speak first, because we need the political framework of the question, what is really happening?
Thank you very much, Ambassador Cengizler, for that very kind introduction, and also to you all for inviting me to this conference. It's a real privilege for me and a real honor to be here, and I'm very sincere in my gratitude. When I was invited to make some comments, to share some thoughts with you, I thought how presumptuous for a political scientist to come all the way from Boston and to talk about the Turkish foreign policy and Turkish regional challenges to a room full of experienced, seasoned diplomats, all of whom have years and years of insight into the subject. Nevertheless, I'll try to share some opening thoughts to get the conversation going, and hopefully I'll be able to make at least 1 or 2 useful comments to you. The other thought that occurred to me when I was invited was, what jumped to my mind is another meeting, a very, very different meeting of ambassadors that I remember reading about many years ago. This one in 1975 in Baghdad. It wasn't a liberal exchange of ideas. It was Saddam Hussein inviting all of his diplomats and giving them this famous speech that he gave. This was 1975. The Ba'ath Party had come to power in Iraq with its allies in 1968. Spent the first few years, of course, trying to consolidate its hold on power, eliminate its rivals, essentially struggled just to consolidate its hold on power. But by 1975, that consolidation phase had been accomplished somewhat successfully. After 1973, oil revenues were pouring in. The regime felt more confident, more able to step back from the day-to-day tactical struggle for survival and to take a broader strategic view of the panorama that confronted the country. And so Saddam Hussein gave his thoughts to his ambassadors to explain to them why he had called them in. He said, look, we are now living in a bipolar order with the United States and the Soviet Union. This is a very stable order, but it's going to give way in time. And he actually gave a date. He said in 20 years or so, so 1995, it will give way to a multipolar order. New poles are emerging, new powers are emerging, Europe is consolidating, you have the Chinese, you have the Japanese, the Indians, all kinds of other countries. What's interesting is that he said this transition from bipolarity to multipolarity will give a country such as us, Iraq, greater room for maneuver to pursue its ambitions. He argued that whereas the bipolar order was stable, right, multipolar order is likely to involve much more complexity, much more opportunities, as well as challenges for mid-range revisionist powers such as Iraq. So he said, therefore, the next 20 years, we have to prepare as a country for this transition to multipolarity, at which time we will be able to pursue our bid to take leadership of the Arab world and maybe transform this region into one of the poles in this new emerging multipolar world order. And your role as ambassadors who I've called in is to cultivate our relationships, particularly with those new emerging powers that will be rivals to the United States and who will seek to undermine American hegemony in our region. That's why I'm calling you in. So you know how important it is to cultivate good relations, not just with Russia, but with France and with other emerging powers as well. Now, and in other ways as well, of course, we will develop ourselves economically, militarily, industrially, in all kinds of ways to prepare for this time. I'm telling you this story not because I want to show how prescient Saddam Hussein was or how well informed about international relations theory and neo-realist political theory he was, but to contrast it with, for example, the comment that President Obama made in one of the presidential debates with Mitt Romney in 2012. Romney had been advocating a much more robust military buildup, more attention to potential dangers coming from Russia and other potential rivals. And President Obama, future President Obama, mocked him. He mocked him. He said the 1980s are calling, the Cold War is calling, they want their Cold War back. To say that you live, your thoughts, your ideas are passé. The future American president could not see what Saddam Hussein could see all the way back in 1975, that instead of a much more robust, much more cooperative and stable world, the end of the Cold War would in fact usher in a much more conflictual, much more dangerous, much more unstable environment. And in fact, we're already beginning to see that is indeed the case. You here in Turkey, it's a cliche to say that your neighborhood is tough, but you're actually confronting at least two revolutionary upheavals right in your neighborhood. One of them is big demographic, social upheaval that's taking place along this fault line, cultural fault line that extends from Albania all the way to China to the north of you. More directly maybe relevant for today's purposes, of course, are the big upheavals that are taking place in the Arab world to your south. These are both revolutions. They have plunged your entire region, your entire environment into a state of complete flux. So I'll end these introductory comments by pointing out that in a world such as this, it is virtually impossible to pursue a foreign policy that is routine, that is based on established procedures, established relationships, let alone one that is, that attaches primary importance to neutrality, to not getting pulled into conflicts, not having to take sides in one's region. These options are much more difficult in an environment in revolution. Right? There isn't really a status quo to uphold. There isn't a status quo to defend. Choices, as you all very well know, are going to need to be made, difficult choices, not all of them in a way that will not place Turkey in competition with other regional and global powers. So the challenge, it's a really unenviable one for you in the coming years, I'm afraid, in this much more dangerous and unstable world, is going to try to craft a foreign policy for your country that is not doctrinaire, that is not passive, that is nimble and agile and artful. And I'll stop here, I think, for now.
Thank you, Malik. Mr. Obama seems still to think that it's an orderly world,
Yes.
in a way. Mustafa, I think you can, as a Turkish expert, try to reflect on Malik. It is obvious that we have been all talking about this anyway. We don't have an enviable job, but on the other hand, it makes Turkish foreign policy one of the most relevant foreign policies today. What we'll choose to do is not important for us and our near abroad, so to say, but for the whole world, because this is a global world more than ever, and our choices are very important. It seems that we are the only country remaining with a strong state tradition and all required apparatus. So we can only fail not to see ourselves, as our foreign minister explained this morning, that we have not only a job to do, but we have ideals and altruistic ones to follow. So you all know better than many of us what we are trying to do and how indeed difficult it is, or whatever you want to say, of course.
Okay, thank you very much. It's nice to be here and trying to talk in front of all these Turkish ambassadors. Of course, I would never dream of talking about Turkish foreign policy in this audience. No way. So you're not going to get me into that discussion here. Indeed, Ambassador Cengizler, when he called me, I said, what are we going to talk? And he said, don't worry, it's a free flow of ideas. I said, what ideas? He said, anything you want to say. Then, of course, as a good Turkish academic, I went to the webpage of Foreign Ministry and looked into the press release of this conference and tried to see what you want to discuss here in this year. So I saw few words like humanitarian issues, migration, refugees, development, foreign aid, conflict resolution, and etc. So I said, okay, maybe I can come up with some ideas about these issues and global problems, and then we can reflect on how these are affecting Turkey and the environment around Turkey. And just outside, I again asked the ambassador whether any figures were given yesterday and before about all these issues, and he said, as diplomats, we love figures, so talk about figures. And finally, when he was introducing us, he said, you yesterday and the day before, I think, you all reflected that you want to talk about realistic issues, not idealistic or theoretical worldviews. This is good because I usually been accused of too much realism or too much pessimism, which is more or less the same thing. But I disagree, of course. I think that it is well-informed optimism that makes you realist. So let me start with some figures and some ideas what's happening in the world since the end of the Cold War. And then that will, I think, would put Turkey into that. And of course, I'll try to deal with this general idea of the conference here. As a pessimist, I'll start with the worst ideas or news. We are, not only as Turkey, but we are in the world facing the most difficult crisis of humanitarian scale since the end of the Cold War, since the end of the Second World War. It's not only Syria, it's not only Middle East. All over the world, we are having humanitarian problems popping up everywhere. Not only conflicts and political and military conflicts, but man-made disasters, environmental problems, poverty, inequalities, everything. And that forces most of the people to start to moving around the world, trying to seek better lives. The numbers I told you that I will talk about present a dismal view. End of the last year, 2014, not 2015, 2014, there were around 60 million people in the world, globally, forcibly displaced from their home.
It's 80 million now.
Now it's 80
Even
million.
worse.
So they are roaming around the world, trying to find better lives. This means that globally, 1 in every 100 people, 1 of them are displaced and trying to seeking new life. And thus, I think humanitarian issues has become the defining idea and the problem for the 21st century. So whatever we are talking of building the international system, rebuilding the international system, whenever we are talking about the conflicts, the Middle East, the environment around Turkey, neighborhood, we have to keep in mind that the defining the problem and the issue would be humanitarian crisis for the years to come. And more importantly, I think, again, for Turkey, because we are covered with them, developing world is very crucial in discussion of these issues. Because most of the problems seems to be emerging in developing or less developed part of the world, and they are concentrating increasingly. If you look at the figures again, since the end of the Second World War, most of the conflicts, armed conflicts, both intrastate conflicts and interstate warfare are increasingly concentrating in special or certain areas of the world, which are usually less developed part of the world, and they are increasingly around Turkey, of course. And if you are sitting in Ankara and looking around, all you see is warfare, conflict, fight, and difficult countries, failing states, and very dismal view of the world, actually. And of course, all these problems in the last quarter of a century is now came to coincide with the global financial crisis as well, and global financial recession, which is affecting how we can manage conflicts, how we can deal with the disasters, and how we can increase the humanitarian aid also. And this is, of course, also coinciding with a weaker leadership profile globally. A few months ago, we were talking, a friend of mine in Istanbul, and we were trying to invite somebody to Turkey, somebody important to talk about global issues. And, we said, oh, Gorbachev is not around anymore. Clinton is now old. Even Blair is passé. Who to invite? When you are looking globally, the leaders, there is not many that could inspire people, right? Obama, well, he got the Peace Prize without doing anything. then, you know, if you got the Peace Prize doing anything, then why should you work more? You know? If you look at Europe and the policies that the European Union is developing in recent years, then you would see that there is a crisis of leadership in Europe as well. So when we are talking about the fragile states, failed states, these are, of course, concentrating mostly on developing countries. But in the developed world, there is a crisis of leadership. It's not failed state, it's not failing states, but there is a problem there because that problem is also causing us weaknesses globally to deal with the problems of the world. And it's very unfortunate that growing number of states now, if you look at the figures and indexes, the growing number of states are now characterized by chronic problems and fragility. They are not solving, and we are not helping to solve them, any of their problems, and the weak governance seems to be spreading. People have now started talking of receding of democracy. Of course, this is based on the earlier idea of the early post-Cold War, post-Cold War era, that the democracy was developing and democracy was spreading around the world, but it seems now it's receding. So all this optimism of the early post-Cold War era didn't bore the results. And globalization. Many of you, and most of you, I'm sure, would remember how globalization, the idea of globalization was discussed in this country in the early 1990s and late 1990s. Many people in Turkey were against the idea of globalization, as if you can be against of a process. But nevertheless, when you look at globalization, it created a number of negative impacts. Some impacts that we didn't foresee. For example, rising food prices. It's increasingly affecting livelihood of many people who are forcing them to move out of their countries. There is a good side, there are good sides of globalization, which created more mobility for the people, which increased better opportunities for education, better communication. All these skills enabled most of the people who are living in the less developed countries to seek better lives in the developed world, thereby creating another problem to solve. You know, they became sort of refugees, global refugees, not forced out of their countries by warfare or persecution, but kind of willingly they became refugees. They moved out their own countries and they go especially towards Europe and towards developed countries, which, by the way, do not like them to come. So this is another problem that we have to be looking at. And of course, the humanitarian assistance around the world is increasing, and Turkey is doing more than its share on this. It has become the policy of this country that Turkey should be active in humanitarian area, and assistance has been increasing in last 10 years, obviously. But it seems that it's not solving the problems, because not only Turkey, but many other countries, even though not only Turkey, but many other countries increase their humanitarian assistance, the difference between the needs and the amounts that are generated are huge. Billions of dollars are still needed, and there is no way that we could gather them. There is also no working international system to deal with all these problems of conflicts, conflict prevention, conflict management, conflict solution, and etc. I'll finish with one observation.
Yeah.
Of course,
then I will give you floor.
Of course, we all know there is a United Nations and Security Council whose responsibility is to deal with the global conflicts or problems to the peace of the world. But we all know that its inability, actually, in effect, to deal most of these problems. So let me finish with dismal worldview here, and maybe next time I'll talk about the solutions.
Thank you. Let's hope that they will reinforce that dismal worldview, so we will start to do something about that. Turkey is in fact, according to 2013 figures, we spent $1.6 billion in humanitarian aid. That makes us the third country, as you know, in the wake of the United States and United Kingdom. And we have become a member of the Geneva Group. There's 15 most important donor countries, and these are all UN figures. Both Malik and Mustafa, they gave us a workable framework to start delving deeper into. So I recognize Mr. Zaks. Thank you so much for coming here, Mr. Zaks. We will be sharing the floor tomorrow with Mr. Margaret Macmillan and Stephen O'Brien. So, Mr. Pritchett, this has been too much maybe theoretical, but both you and Raphael were activists on the floor, and then I think you have a different perspective that we need to know about that perspective as well. And then I hope we'll have time for questions. And by the way, you are not only addressing our ambassadors, but also our future ambassadors, our deputy director generals and other carrier diplomats are in the saloon. And by the way, you might wish to know that we are right now the 7th largest diplomatic organization in the world. We'll be opening 18 more missions that will put us to the 5th place. Of course, this is there are no rivalries as such. I just wanted to say these words so that you know that we are really well represented around the world, and the humanitarian aspect of our diplomacy is very sincere and very important to us. As the writer of those mind-boggling, voluminous World Bank reports, what do we have to make from all those reports, really?
So I would like to speak directly to the issue of humanitarian problems and humanitarian assistance. And I think the root cause of what we call a humanitarian crisis is nearly always a lack of state capability. We often think that a humanitarian crisis is caused by an earthquake or by a war. But that's in some sense looking at the proximate cause, not the deep cause. You know, Japan can have an earthquake, and it's not a humanitarian crisis because Japan has the capability as a country to address the consequences of an earthquake. Haiti has an earthquake, and buildings aren't rebuilt for 3 years. So at the root, one of Amartya Sen's most famous early works was pointing out that the cause of famines was almost never a lack of food. There was food being, in one of the most famous famines of the 20th century, the Bengali famine, there was food being exported from the region in which the famine was occurring during the entire course of the famine. The cause of famines is lack of state action. So if you don't build state capability, you're not addressing current, future, and humanitarian crises. I think there's 3 ways in which the world is currently working on humanitarian crises that is counterproductive to the goal of building state capability. And I just want you to think of these 3 things for which I'm going to use a metaphor for each, right? The first is, are you building a scaffolding or are you building a wall? Because sometimes when you need to build a wall, what do you need to build first? You build a scaffolding around the wall. And then with the scaffolding, you build the wall. But what often happens in humanitarian assistance, and I'm afraid I can't stay in a white chair, can I get up? Is you think, well, to do humanitarian assistance, we need this, and we need this, and we need this, and I'm going to take yours, and we need this. And then you think, oh, we need this too. And then you think, I got to have something to put this on.
Yes,
Wouldn't
we don't.
If I had a shelf. But I don't have time to build a shelf. I need to put this down right now, so what do? Well, I got to put it down somewhere, so I go and I grab a chair. And I go, a chair. I could work with a shelf.
This is what they call Harvard case studies, which made it world famous.
I'm done.
This is disaster.
So then when the humanitarian crisis is over, they don't have a shelf. They have a chair. But they really needed a shelf. And so what we find again and again is in the emergency assistance, when the states lack capability to do it, we turn to other actors like NGOs that do have the capability to do it, and we task them with carrying out core state functions and ignore the real long-term consequences of having supplanted the core state function in the humanitarian mode, and we leave them with a chair that gets carted away by the people at the end of the day, and then the next crisis, you know what? They still don't have a wall. All you built was a scaffolding. So first point, scaffolding versus a wall. Second point is we often allow in our attempts to build state capability for a phenomena to persist called isomorphic mimicry. What is isomorphic mimicry? Well, isomorphic mimicry comes from the world of natural evolution, where you see animals that develop camouflage so they look like other animals. And it gets them survival value to look like another animal. So there's two kinds of snakes in the world. One's an eastern coral snake, and one is the scarlet snake. And they both have red, yellow, and black stripes, bands. Why? Well, because one of the snakes is deadly poisonous, and in a metaphorical Kipling-esque kind of sense, the other snake realized, venom, who needs it? As long as I look like a poisonous snake, everybody's going to avoid me just as if I were a poisonous snake. So what do we do when we build state capability? Is we allow countries to build the facade of a state, to project the image of a state, to create the appearance that there's a state without actually anything behind it. And we're satisfied with the isomorphism. The isomorphism projects a legitimacy of the state without actually saying, is there anything underneath and behind this isomorphism? Now, I know isomorphic mimicry is a weird name, but every one of you in this room understands it. In particular, the men. I want every man in the room to take his right hand and reach right here. What do you find? You find a tie. Why are you wearing a tie? Because if you wear a tie, you look like a diplomat. Are you a diplomat? Maybe you are. But you know you look like a diplomat. And what's happened in our attempts to build state capability is often the international system has put more attention to building the facade of the state than into building the state. So that's the second concept. Scaffolding versus wall, isomorphic mimicry versus building the reality. And the third, and this is part of one of the World Bank reports I worked on, which was a report on fragility and fragile states, is the question of the 3 Ds, and aligning the 3 Ds. The 3 Ds are defense, diplomacy, and development. And one of the most damaging myths is that those 3 things can remain in their separate cones and be handled essentially sequentially. So people say, we've got a conflict. That's creating a humanitarian crisis. So what do? We'll solve the conflict. We'll solve the conflict either through defense or diplomacy, and after we solve the conflict, then we'll do development. Acting as if those things can be separated and acting if those things can be easily sequenced. Well, in the study of conflicts, what you find is that it's actually the very rare conflict that has a beginning and has an end and stays ended. Most of the conflicts in the world are recurring conflicts that flare up periodically, in part because the 3 Ds never got integrated. In the interest of creating a short-term resolution of the conflict from the point of view of the international system, you ignore the building the true developmental state capability that will prevent the conflict from reemerging. So often there's a rush to solve the conflict that rather than solve it, papers it over, and doesn't in fact put adequate emphasis on how do we reconstitute a genuinely capable state that truly integrates the needs of the citizens in a way that won't lead to a recurrent conflict, after which we parachute back in the diplomats and defense people, and the development people retreat again in what can often be a vicious cycle. So I just wanted to make the point that state capability is at the root of many of the problems. The difference is not the severity of the earthquake, it's the capability to handle it that creates a humanitarian crisis, and that many conflicts are just caused by essentially a weak state. A weak state can't resist the fracture. So it's not the fundamental cause of the conflict isn't this particular ethnic thing or that particular grievance. It's actually the capability of the state hasn't been built. And in building state capability, we make three mistakes. We build a scaffolding, not a wall. We allow putting on a tie to make person a diplomat. And we allow the three Ds to act as if they can be sequenced versus integrated. Thank you.
Thank you, Lent. Very, very interesting. And true to your advice, we'll keep the disaster and skip the second most important stage. But Rafael...
took away somebody's water, though.
No, it's all right. Rafael, now, as the director of Mr. Zach's Earth Institute, this is daily life for you. All these questions you have to deal with all the time. So maybe you could expand on those, and this is really very rewarding from our diplomat's point of view as well. Thank you.
Oh, let me start by thanking you, Ambassador Cengiz, sir, for your kind invitation and for this honor.
Thank you.
Let me focus my remarks in the area that I am more familiar with, which is our global food system and food security.
Yes, food security is the beginning and end, anyway. Yeah.
So, as we all know, back in September, 193 UN nations ratified the Sustainable Development Goals. The second goal is to end hunger and has four main components. The first one is to end hunger. The second one is to achieve food security. The third one is improve nutrition. And the fourth one is to promote sustainable agriculture. Now, we live in a world where our food system is truly globalized, thanks to the development of our global transport system. And we depend. Food moves from one end of the world to the other. And our populations, especially in urban areas, demand to have access to the same foods all year round. Now, what is happening is that we expect to have, between now and 2050, an additional 2.4 billion people in the world, out of which 1.9 will be concentrated, or the growth will come from 48 least developed countries. Most of them, 27 of them, are in sub-Saharan Africa. These nations are food insecure, and they are prone to climate change, or they will suffer most of the effects of climate change. So that's one aspect of, we'll have an increase in population. The second one, there will be economic growth coming mostly from Asia. We'll have a double of our global output by 2035. And then it will close to triple by 2050. And the growth will be concentrated mostly in three countries: China, India, and the United States. And the gap between the global output of those three economies and the remaining 12 is going to be extremely large. So even if you put the output of the next 5 economies together, they won't get to the amount of output that India, China, or the United States would have. So that'll create more instability. So when you put a growing population with additional wealth together, of course there will be additional demand for food. And unlike the contribution made by Amartya Sen, this is not going to be an issue only about distribution, but about food supply. We'll need to produce more food by 2050. It is expected that we need to produce 50% more food by 2030, and between 60 and 100% more food by 2050. So again, we move back to an issue of how do we produce more food? And how do we produce it in a climate that is changing? So with the climate change, there will be more volatility in terms of overall agricultural production, because we'll have more extreme events, we'll have more droughts, we'll have more floods, and then temperature will increase. So again, this will create additional instability, and especially in least developed countries and fragile states. Now, another point that I wanted to make is that it will also potentially can affect the distribution of food. We'll have to rethink about our global food system, because if we have extreme events and the food moves all around the world, this can constrain our ability to move that food, especially to urban areas. And the last point that I want to make, and then we can move, is that we are seeing already an increase of extreme events, and the losses from those extreme events are relatively high. In 2013, it is estimated that the losses from extreme events amounted to $370 billion. That's not a small amount of money by any means. And the FAO estimates that we have increased from around 100 extreme events in the 1990s to about 500 extreme events in the 2000s. So again, we are seeing a large number of extreme events occurring due to climate change.
Thank you, Rafael. I assume Mustafa is a happier man now because he has been vindicated in his pessimism. It's very difficult to see. We should continue to be optimists because there is a lot, not only as Turkish diplomacy, members of Turkish diplomacy, but diplomacy there is a returning back to diplomacy, I think, because it still is the most sane and defensible line. We are not very happy with the results of the Paris Climate Summit because our place again between East and the West, developed and more developed, has not been well defined. But at any rate, it has been a success. That is one of the very few points of optimism. But I think all you have been saying is people dealing with the nitty-gritty of things all the day. That puts us on more responsibility, on a more intelligent diplomacy, rather than power games or seeking new spheres of influence and all that. In fact, theories that should have been outdated only by the virtue of 2 world wars, anyway. But Mustafa, if you don't mind, I think we'll have to leave here at 8 sharp so that we can be present at Kenyan Foreign Minister's speech. So let me open the floor. Let me receive a few questions, and then we'll proceed with that. Our ambassador to New Delhi, Mr. Burak Akçapar, he is here. Do we have the microphone system? Or should I speak up? I don't see any microphones coming up. Somebody, it's coming. It's coming. He is a pessimist who thought the first question should be from the very back.
Okay, some 15 seconds have been taken away from me because I waited for the microphone. I'll condense my question. Professor Pritchett, you have criticized the way we do business in the official development aid front. And basically there's an increasing body of literature, there's more and more people coming forward and saying that it's not about giving just aid or just giving humanitarian aid. And ODA comprises both development aid and humanitarian aid in a strange way. But the two are related, and in a vicious circle, as you have pointed out. People are criticizing it. And in this country, there's a lot of sympathy for the alchemical approach that you have kind of set out, that we need to change certain things. We need to address institutions. The current setup is not answering the mail, including, of course, our motto that the world is larger than five. So our criticism goes to the very core of the UN system. I take it that as the criticism is rising, there's also a change that is building up, coming from the West mostly. Strings are now attached more and more to development aid. So countries are asking before they give money for the recipient countries to do certain capacity building reforms. And that is all fine, but now we see that the increase in development aid is coming more and more from the developing world or the emerging world. India is, you lived in India. India is rising as a donor. China is rising as a donor. Brazil is. Mexico is, and definitely Turkey is. And if you look at India's aid, for instance, they don't have these strings. They're against attaching strings. So is China, and so is perhaps the entire new actors in the development field. How do you see the challenge? Do we have now two major strands working against each other? And where do you think we're going? Thank you.
No, I think you can answer. That's a very intelligent question. Really, China and the others, the new emerging powers, they don't attach any strings. But then you end up, there's a dilemma, because if you don't attach strings, then they will start doing what they were doing anyway. So maybe you should answer first, and then we'll take out.
So I think the advent of the new donors has been an enormously positive thing and will continue to be a positive thing. It could be because it has, in some sense, broken the stranglehold of the isomorphic mimicry of the strings. Because a lot of what the West has been requiring in terms of actions that governments take in order to get aid didn't really make any difference. They weren't, in fact, specifications of the outcomes that jointly we wanted. Rather, they were specifications of processes and forms through which it was imagined those outcomes would be achieved. So let me just tell you one. I went to Afghanistan in 2006, and my World Bank colleagues in Afghanistan literally couldn't leave the building because the state couldn't provide security to them. And what were they working on? They were working on the pay scale of the civil service in Afghanistan. How would we specify whether a level 14 civil servant, how much more they make than a level 15 civil servant, and what are the characteristics of a level 14 civil servant versus a level 15 civil servant? And I was like, this isn't deck chairs on the Titanic. This is the umbrellas in the drinks in the cup holders on the deck chairs of the Titanic. You couldn't imagine something that was less relevant to the future of whether Afghanistan was going to build a capable state than getting the forms of the pay scale of a barbarian bureaucracy correct, right? So, first point, I think the advent of the non-Western donors has really blown the space wide open. That said, I worry that many of the new donors are making exactly the same mistakes that the previous donors made 30 years ago and that the previous donors learned from, which is, again, not an adequate specification of how are you really going to build the capability to sustain the assets that you could build. So China's coming in and going, I mean, I was talking with the head of the Chinese aid agency, and he says, why don't you guys just build roads? I don't get it. I go to Africa and they just need roads. Why aren't you just building roads? Well, the answer is, for the 80s and 90s, that's all we did was build roads. And what we found is the total stock of passable roads wasn't going up. Why? Because we weren't building the organizations and institutions to maintain the roads. And so foreign aid was essentially net foregone operations and maintenance. We just capitalized operations and maintenance into aid. So they didn't pay enough attention to the conditions for the sustainability through building strong state capability. So I worry that the next generation are coming in and making the mistakes. That said, I think by India, China, Turkey coming in a larger role, they're closer to the reality of the countries they're working with and less enamored of isomorphic mimicry, where they can actually work together on locally nominated problems in new and different ways and reveal that there are ways that aid can in fact be really effective if you allow it to have a long horizon and if you truly work cooperatively on locally nominated problems rather than coming in with externally nominated solutions.
Thank you. Any of you would like to add anything on that? Please,
sure,
Malik. Yes.
Sure. I'll type I'd like to just take some issue with what you said about the world of power and spheres of influence being passé in this area of humanitarian
Idealistically.
Yeah. My teacher at graduate school, one of my teachers, Stanley Hoffman, who passed away a few weeks ago only, he came up with this notion called the enforcement paradox. When it comes to humanitarian intervention. The enforcement paradox is that no effective humanitarian intervention can take place unless it is driven, really, by the support and active leadership of powerful actors, powerful, necessarily, countries. And you had in mind primarily the United States. The problem is countries, powerful actors like the United States, like China, like Turkey, are not going to engage in this kind of significant intervention unless it coincides with their national interests. That's just the reality of it. And certainly not where it conflicts with that interest. So that kind of intervention then is always open to the charge of hypocrisy, of double standards, of doing something here but not doing something there, which is inevitable. That's the way it has to be. So this problem, I think, is rendered even more acute by what my colleague just said, which is that really effective intervention, effective aid, actually has to go beyond simply providing the palliative measures for disasters of various kinds. It has to actually engage in state building. State building. Imagine how controversial even the provision of emergency aid is, given this enforcement paradox. Add to that the necessity of actually transforming institutionally the countries that you're trying to help, and then that enforcement paradox becomes even more acute. And so I don't see really any way of escaping the dominance of power considerations and sphere of influence considerations.
Yeah, when I alluded to spheres of influence, I had, of course, in mind the recent Russian interventions. Yesterday, they bombed a hospital, killing 30 children. So in that sense, spheres of influence politics further aggravates the humanitarian problems, as long as they are perceived in the fashion they now. Or else, of course, all countries are expected to act on their own national interests, and that would make things simpler. But in 2005, 2015, things got out of hand. That's really what I had in mind. Otherwise, I think we all need to be realists. Any more questions from the floor? Yes, please. Yes. Sorry, Hassan, you will have the floor next. Yeah.
You know, I wanted just to add, based on the experience that we have from one of our main projects that's called the Millennium Villages in Sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the things that we have learned is that we need to strengthen the capacities of the local governments for them to be able to provide basic services. And this is a continuous process. It's not something that, you know, starts here and ends here, or, you know, just go, you know, provide some interventions and then you leave. It's truly a partnership and an engagement that takes a long time. And it's a continuous process where you start with basic things, and then you start to increase in terms of complexity, quality of services, and level of investment. And I think that's something that Professor Sachs has been promoting and advocating for decades now.
Thank you, Rafael. Mustafa, would you like to?
Just to add few ideas. We are talking about development aid. The idea is to help countries to develop, right, with foreign aid. But most of the studies are inconclusive on this regard. There is one study that looked into 97 cases, and it concluded that the development aid in these 97 cases did not really lead to positive impact. Maybe a small amount of usually statistically insignificant amount of development. Secondly, there is an argument that this official development aid most of the times distorts the development pattern of the receiving country, economic development pattern of the receiving country. Usually it emphasizes the donor country's preferences for the economic development of the receiving country. So that is a huge problem there. And thirdly, I'll name a country. As diplomats you might not, but I can. There is a study which showed in 2012, 12 million pounds of UK development aid spent in Britain for projects such as global citizenship lessons in Scottish schools, military and security training for officials of African countries in UK's Defence Academy. So this is a development aid spending. And it's not an isolated case. So maybe it's a good idea that countries like Turkey or India, who are developing countries in a sense, coming into the development aid business. Because I'll finish with a Turkish saying, çatıdan düşenin halinden çatıdan düşen anlar.
Yes. Do I need to translate this?
It's very difficult. I cannot translate that into
Now that's good news, because that will put us into the second place. Because we were third in the wake of United Kingdom. So if they are doing that, we are not doing that. Anyway, the most recent Turkish experience is really should be more celebrated. I will give the floor to Hasan Ulusoy, who is the Director General for UN Affairs. But more importantly, as you know, we are organizing this the first ever World Humanitarian Summit on 23rd and 24th of May. He is, along with Stephen O'Brien, I would say, who will be here tomorrow, he is responsible. But before you take the floor, I hope our ambassador in Somalia, etc., are also here, because they wrote true success stories in that part of the world. But please, Hasan, you go, and we have 10 minutes maybe.
Very briefly, thank you very much for all these interventions, very enriching. But I think also they all attest the fact of growing complexity of humanitarian crises of mainly different natures. And I'm sure you also dealt with the issues, if I follow up what Mr. Aydın said. The development aids can be used for different purposes. But also, I'm sure you are aware of the Turkish model, or let's say the approach, based on the humanitarian diplomacy. What is it? To use the humanitarian assistance programs in a combined manner with, let's say, development, stabilization, or environment tools as appropriate according to the specific issues, specific cases. And I will not go into the detail because you are all knowing all these details, I'm sure. Only thing I would like to share with you, as our ambassador said, we will host the World Humanitarian Summit, and we plan to also organize an economic forum prior to the summit. So we would be very pleased to have you all to enrich the discussion before the summit as well. So you could consider as an invitation follow up to this interesting meeting. Thank you very much.
You follow that up. I have the addresses. Well, we'll, of course, be delighted to receive you all back here. You'll be, anyway, and Mr. Zaks, I hope, should be. The realpolitik is that our foreign minister is giving a dinner in honor of the Kenyan foreign minister. So he expects us to be there. That, in practical terms, that means still one. I think our former Consul General in Paris, who chose to went to Mid Africa to do more humanitarian work. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. This discussion rolled the way towards the ambassadors in Africa, so I took the floor. Yes. Some of us at least, not to give names of countries, know about isomorphic mimicry by living in that. But the structures that exist are the only way to go through to help those people living on those geographies. And also, there was a discussion on how not to aid. So can the floor help us to show the way how to help those people? Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is, you should start first because people first need
Jeffrey
to.
Wants to
okay.
Yes. I mean, I am not, in fact, an aid pessimist. I am an aid optimist. I think it can, lots of things can, I think of nearly every time you've heard the piano played, you've heard it played badly. That doesn't condemn that piano playing can be an excellent thing. So yes, there are lots of empirical studies saying aid is often done badly. But that suggests that rather than say, well, let's not have the piano ever played, how do we play the piano better? I'm working on a book that should be ready in a few weeks about precisely how do you work with local contexts, local governments, in order to build their capabilities while you deliver results. Because I think the donors split those two things. They think, I have a set of activities that are going to build capacity, and then I have a set of activities that are going to deliver results. And when the pendulum swings to delivering results, they often swing towards cocooned building of scaffolding or pipelining the aid around the existing governmental structures. And then when they build capacity, oh, well, we'll go train some civil servants. So we're working on a new method that tries to build capacity while delivering results, but we emphasize up front that you really have to entertain it in a very different way, more long-term, more locally engaged of doing development assistance, which Turkey may well already be on the path to, but we are precisely working on how to do it better. And I don't think it's impossible. We see lots of cases where if you take the right approach, you can do both. You can deliver results and you can build capability of the organization simultaneously by building the results. But what you have to free yourself of is what has plagued, in some sense, this industry, which is allowing isomorphic mimicry and expecting too much too soon. Countries come in and they say, well, here is a country that lacks state capability. Here's a 5-year program to build state capability. That's ridiculous. That's just ridiculous. You should say, this is a 5-year segment of a 50-year plan to build state capability, and then you have some hope of success.
Thank you. Well, good diplomacy is prompt diplomacy. We'll be together anyway at the dinner. So thank you very much. It has really been enriching because in our working lives, we tend to be, as I said, somewhat too theoretical. We should know better, and we are much desirous to do that as Turkish diplomats, to know the ground, and we are very well represented over the world. There won't be a place in Africa where we won't be represented in a year's time. So that makes Turkish diplomacy, in and of itself, as an important player, not in the sense of the power games, but what we can do in humanitarian aid. So thank you for my colleagues as well, honoring us here, and thank you. Thank you very much.
Very entertaining.
Science
I do. Yes, I do.
and lecture or
No,
part?
art and science.
In the real part.
So we'll go to the
Maybe we shouldn't call it.
if she wants to finish.